Hello and welcome. I'm Andrew Stone Porter, and I'm speaking today as part of Scholar Strike, a nationwide campaign that asks faculty to abstain from teaching and administrative work on September 8th and 9th in order to underscore the injustices facing Black Americans. Please note that this lecture includes details about lynching that may be upsetting to some viewers. Today I'm going to talk about race and wealth creation. The Black Lives Matter movement in recent years has drawn global attention to police killings of Black people and challenged us to reimagine policing. That work is obviously crucial, and I recently wrote an op-ed in the Courier Journal on policing, which you can read here. White supremacy in America is most obvious and egregious when police kill unarmed Black people. But the movement for Black Lives envisions policing as only one component of a much larger system. If we believe that Black Lives matter, we have to understand that we need to radically reshape not just policing, but also our systems of education, healthcare, housing, economics, government, and more. There's a perception that if we could all simply affirm that Black Lives matter, we would end racism in America. But the phrase Black Lives Matter isn't a magic spell. The affirmation, while tremendously important, cannot undo centuries of material history. Today, I want to briefly talk about why slavery didn't end in 1865 and Jim Crow didn't end in 1965. And I hope this will make clear that ending white supremacy in America requires much more of us than a change of attitudes, although it requires that too. Because of time constraints, I will not talk about the transatlantic slave trade, which is among the greatest acts of genocide in human history, or the enslavement of Black people, which in addition to being a brutal system of dehumanizing torture and rape of Black bodies, was the principal driving force in creating the American capitalist society we know today. But despite the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865, which outlawed slavery, Southern politicians were desperate to maintain conditions approximating slavery for Black people, and they found an ally in the alcoholic racist President Andrew Johnson. Johnson vetoed legislation Congress passed in 1865, which would have delivered 40 acres of land to each freedman. Southern states passed draconian Black codes restricting the rights and mobility of freed people and arresting Black people for vagrancy if they could not produce papers. A terrorist organization called the Ku Klux Klan was formed in Tennessee in 1866 to intimidate, assault, and kill Black people who transgressed racial norms. During the brief Reconstruction period, however, a Civil Rights Act and the 14th and 15th Amendments secured protections for Black people, including the vote for Black men. A Freedmen's Bureau was established to help Black people transition to freedom, although it was underfunded, led mostly by patronizing white people, and ineffective. Black men ran for and were elected to office and advocated for land reform, equal access to education, women's rights, a 10-hour workday, prohibitions against domestic violence, and integrated facilities. But by the 1870s, political support for Reconstruction had begun to wane. Democrats took control of state governments throughout the South and moved quickly to reinstate strictures of white dominance. In the contested election of 1876, a compromise installed Republican Rutherford B. Hayes as president, with the informal understanding that as president, Hayes would remove federal troops from the South. He did so in 1877, returning home rule to Southern whites. Most free Black Americans continued to work on white-owned farms as sharecroppers, where they were paid subsistence wages and often compensated in scrip only redeemable at the plantation store, which inevitably had higher prices than outside stores. In many cases, freed workers were still whipped. George Conway, an Arkansas sharecropper, one year raised 20 bales of cotton worth $3,500. Conway was certain he had not purchased more than $300 worth of goods from the plantation store during the year. Yet at harvest time, he was told he owed $40. When he asked for an itemized accounting of his debts, Conway was beaten, and the white landowner seized his goods and drove him off the plantation. In such cases, Black folks knew it was useless to appeal in court. Whites also developed a convict leasing system in which black sharecroppers unable to pay their fraudulent debts or convicted of other specious crimes were sold off to work on white-owned coal mines and farms. This system, which Douglas Blackman calls slavery by another name, claimed years and sometimes lifetimes of up to 200,000 black people. By the 1890s, the process of re-entrenchment of state-sanctioned white supremacy was well underway. The 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court decision ignored the 14th Amendment's Equal Protections Clause and ruled that Jim Crow laws were constitutional. White Southerners stripped black people of their newly won voting rights by imposing literacy tests, poll taxes, and property requirements, but exempting poor whites with grandfather clauses, conferring voting rights on anyone whose father or grandfather had been eligible in 1867. According to Angela Sims, between 1882 and 1930, white Southerners lynched nearly one black person per week. Lynching was a public spectacle, often advertised in newspapers and drawing crowds of up to 20,000 spectators. After the victim was hanged or slowly burned to death for hours, white onlookers would cut off the victim's genitals, fingers, toes, and ears and take them as souvenirs. And of course, there was the Jim Crow segregation practice of separate and unequal treatment. Black people were prohibited from using any of the same public facilities as whites. They must address white people as Mr., Mrs., or Ms., while whites could call African Americans by their first names or by pejoratives like boy, auntie, or uncle. They must move out of the way when meeting whites on the sidewalk, remove their hats when speaking to whites, and enter white houses and facilities through the back door. Whites, on the other hand, could enter a black person's house without knocking, sit without being invited to, and keep their hats on. Segregation became an obsession, such that in Florida, children's textbooks were housed in race-segregated storage facilities, and some courtrooms even had 2 Bibles for swearing in witnesses. A 1930 Birmingham ordinance made it unlawful for a black and white person to play dominoes or checkers together. Meanwhile, black people responded with a variety of tactics to these practices. Courageous activists like Ida B. Wells Barnett risked their lives to expose and end lynching. W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, and Marcus Garvey envisioned vastly different paths to black liberation. Black women's clubs, churches, and other mutual aid societies worked to lift up community members in need. The Great Depression was especially hard on African Americans who were systematically excluded from many of the government's recovering efforts, such as the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and the Public Works Administration. The National Recovery Act established a minimum wage, but excluded domestic service and unskilled labor, sectors in which 60% of black people were employed. The National Labor Relations Act, passed under FDR in 1935, originally contained a clause stipulating that the National Labor Relations Board would refuse to certify whites-only unions, but this clause was removed after intense pressure from the American Federation of Labor. For decades, unions enabled white industrial workers to access jobs, higher wages, benefits, and protections that were not accessible to African Americans. The best way to build wealth is to own a home. According to sociologist George Lipschitz, the Federal Housing Administration and the Veterans Administration financed more than $120 billion worth of new housing between 1934 and 1962, but less than 2% of this real estate was available to non-white families. The FHA refused to guarantee loans that were destined for African American prospective buyers or loans for white buyers moving into a neighborhood where African Americans lived. Municipal, state, and federal government entities colluded with real estate agents to redline neighborhoods, color-coding black areas red and deeming them high-risk investments. And the FHA refused to guarantee those loans. Further, municipal governments found loopholes to establish economic zones, ensuring that white neighborhoods could contain only residential properties, but black neighborhoods would permit nightclubs, liquor stores, and toxic waste-producing industrial sites. Neighborhood associations sprung up nationwide to enforce restrictive covenants, preventing black people from moving into white neighborhoods. When a black family did move into a white neighborhood, real estate agents engaged in block busting, scaring white residents into a panic by warning them that a black invasion would mean the collapse of their property values. The agents would then buy the homes at discounted prices from the white residents and sell them back at inflated prices to black families desperate for housing. The FHA and the VA guaranteed loans for the construction of entire subdivisions, like William Levitt's Levittown, New York, a whites-only development of 17,500 two-bedroom houses. In 1948, whites could purchase single-family homes in Levittown for $8,000, about $75,000 in today's dollars. But today, those homes routinely sell for $350,000 and up. In the space of 72 years then, a white working-class family could secure hundreds of thousands of dollars in equity, thanks to white supremacist government assistance. Meanwhile, black prospective buyers were excluded from private housing and funneled into overcrowded apartments, polluted neighborhoods, or shoddily constructed public housing. Systematic discrimination ensured that wealth disparities between white and black people would persist for generations. Today, white people out-earn black people by a ratio of 5 to 3, but they out-own them by a ratio of more than 10 to 1. The freedom struggle of the 1960s secured incredible victories for black Americans, including the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and the Fair Housing Act. However, as many have observed, it's much easier to mandate that people drink from the same water fountains than it is to undo centuries of accumulated systematic evil. It is going to take more than uttering the phrase Black Lives Matter to undo white supremacy. It is going to require turning the world on its head. There is, of course, much more to be said about the failure of school integration to meaningfully provide equity in education, about urban renewal projects in which 90% of the black-owned properties which were decimated were never replaced, about the way neoliberalism ravaged black communities, about a racist war on drugs that has led to the United States now incarcerating a higher percentage of its population than any other country in the world, with black men 6 times as likely as white men to be incarcerated. But these mini lectures, teach-ins, are just supposed to be a starting point, and I've already gone over the time suggested by Dr. Butler. My apologies. So let's conclude. A lot has been made in these days of dealing with our white fragility and becoming anti-racist. What I want to suggest is for white folks, the only way to deal with that, what the theologian Tandeka calls white shame, what Jennifer Harvey calls the profound moral crisis of being white, is to connect ourselves with the political program of turning the world upside down. And I want to further suggest that doing so does not have to be an act of sacrifice or self-loathing or white guilt or any of that. It simply instead requires considering what Dr. King realized decades ago, that all human beings are interdependent, and that whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly, and that all of our lives will be more fulfilled if we create a world where Black people thrive. One of my mentors, the womanist ethicist Emily Towns, hopes that her work, among other things, quote, can help all white folks learn that living and loving is much more expansive and fulfilling when one stops believing that hoarding is a form of loving, and it's necessary to look up from one's navel in order to touch into creation. So let's look up from our navels and consider whether we have the imagination, the foolish and courageous and necessary imagination to conceive of a world where Black lives matter and to bring it into being. Here is a list of some of the sources that I consulted in developing this lecture. If you're interested in learning more, I encourage you to read these as a starting point. Thanks everyone for tuning in today, and I hope that this strike is part of a growing movement to produce radical change for our world. Thanks, take care.